Good evening, good afternoon, possibly even good morning. Hello, I'm H.G. Tudor, and welcome to the live stream to provide you with the conclusion as to what Johnny Depp actually is. I take it that you have all poured a mega pint of something appropriate in tribute to this monumental exercise. If you're minded to reward the Herculean effort that your glorious narrator has already put into this, then please flex your super thanks and contribute to a case of dirts to ease my fevered throat. Briefly, it's important to touch upon the methodology that has been utilized here. I have gone through hours upon hours upon hours of material. Interviews, broadcasts, videos, news articles, newspaper interviews, and of course, trial footage and reportage itself. In doing so, I have looked at a wealth of material to look at the behaviors of Johnny Depp in his own words, in the words of others, the reporting of his actions. Done so with regard to those individuals that have spoken favorably about him, some doing so in an impartial manner. Others, they're somewhat partisan. And there are others, of course, who have slung the dirt at Johnny Depp, often with a prior agenda. I've taken material from both sides of the fence with regard to making this determination. It's important to emphasize that one can never make a determination on just one thing to determine what somebody is. You have to, absolutely have to, look at a range of behaviors over an extended period of time to make a determination as to what somebody is. You have to take into account the way that that person has behaved. You have to look at the efficacy of the evidence. You have to look at context and supporting factors. And that's why so many parts have been provided to this examination to ensure that it is done properly. We need to look at many instances of a particular behavior to see if that determines what that person is, but always with due regard to context and surrounding circumstances. What are our potential outcomes? Well, as you can see from the poll, they'll either be normal, empath, narcissistic, or narcissist. Those are the four outcomes. And as I'm talking to you now, empath leads the field on 48%, now 49%, followed by narcissistic at 25%, narcissist at 13%, and normal bringing up the rear, but only just at 12%. As I remarked earlier in the live chat, it's interesting to see that the empath vote has fallen, although remains the favorite. Previously, it was hovering around the 60-62% mark. Johnny Depp's upbringing, I've explained in detail. And essentially, what that provides us with is the fact that his mother was clearly a narcissist. This means that the genetic predisposition towards narcissism may well have found its way to Johnny Depp. It's also clear from the evidence that he has given, and from other sources, that he was experiencing a lack of control environment. This means that there is an increased likelihood of Depp being a narcissist. It's possible that he could be an empath because the genetic predisposition skipped him and he dealt with the lack of control environment in a particular way, which quite possibly could have caused him to be created as a super empath. There is also the possibility that the nature of the behaviors that he found himself exposed to was such that it created a codependent empath also. It might be that the genetic predisposition was present with him and he was exposed to a lack of control environment, which would support him becoming a narcissist. But there was an intervener. His father seems largely not to have been that individual. Quite simply because he was often not around and indeed was often puppeted by the narcissist mother to behave in an abusive way towards Depp, one instance being thrashing him with a belt. It was the case that Depp spoke about Paw, who I believe was his grandfather, and spending quite a bit of time with that individual. So that person could have been an intervening person that would prevent narcissism from becoming fully baked. This upbringing does, however, suggest that the likelihood of him being normal is reduced, and at this early juncture would be the less likely of the four. With regard to Depp's career, he's had a long, largely successful career as a high earner. He's world famous and well liked by millions of people. His sustained career does suggest accountability, but of course, certain narcissists are also able to have long, flourishing careers. A successful career is something that can be enjoyed by all four potential outcomes, but the entertainment field is one that's often successfully navigated by narcissists for reasons which I needn't explain to you, as you're conversant with my work in that regard. He's a high earner. Again, that's attractive to all four potential outcomes, but it is a key residual benefit for a narcissist. A successful acting career does appeal to narcissistic people and narcissists. This, with regard to narcissists, is because it provides a brilliant opportunity to achieve the prime aims. It allows control to be asserted through fame over a wide range of people from whom huge amounts of fuel can be obtained. Think of fan worship, think of concerts, think of the Oscars, concerts where it's a pop star, for instance. There's the acquisition of character traits and a multitude of residual benefits, running from getting a BJ from a groupie to massive wealth to having living the dream with the huge houses and the entourage and all of the other trappings and the networks and the invites and so on and so forth. Depp is, in the main, well liked. Recent disclosures, of course, have brought forth detractors, but on the whole, even with the flaws that are evident, he remains well liked. And does this smack of performance? And this is something, again, that appeals particularly to narcissists, because we are essentially actors. And the ability to perform and be well liked is essentially a narcissist monetizing their narcissism as an actor. Of course, not all narcissists become actors, and of course, not all actors are narcissists, but we are overrepresented in this category. A key consideration also with regard to Depp's career is that actors have certain strong narcissistic traits, namely showcasing pride, vanity, and selfishness. They have to, otherwise, they won't flourish on the stage, on the screen, to the extent that the really successful ones do. Depp, as a successful actor, clearly demonstrates strong narcissistic traits. Therefore, this means that it's highly unlikely that he will be a normal. Potentially, he could be an empath, and it's more likely that he's a narcissist or narcissistic. What about Depp's philanthropy? Depp clearly engages in this repeatedly and has engaged in many charitable activities. This prima facie suggests emotional empathy and empathic traits of, for instance, decency, caring, and compassion. However, as we know, many narcissists use philanthropy with regard to pursuing the prime aims. One only has to look at Harry's wife, Gwyneth Paltrow, Hilary Baldwin, George Clooney, for example. An empath who was engaged in philanthropy was, of course, George Michael, and very little was known about it. He didn't want the publicity. And notwithstanding his strong narcissistic traits, his empathy was far greater, so that he didn't make a big song and dance about it. Now, of course, not all of Depp's philanthropy has been heralded, but it often is. And an important factor is also the fact that Depp prefers often to do his philanthropy in person. It was suggested in the evidence that he had very little interest in the writing of donation checks and knew little about what was going on there. His in person attendance could well be demonstrative, however, of emotional empathy, giving to the people and giving up his time by appearing. But it also suggests that this necessity of interacting with people could be a need to be seen, showcasing admiration, vanity, and possibly even a need for fuel. It clearly again supports strong narcissistic traits. Again, this suggests that he's unlikely to be normal. Potentially, he could be an empath with strong narcissistic traits, a narcissist, or narcissistic. What about Depp's finances? He's a wealthy man, or at least was until certain financial woes came his way. All four of our outcomes can, of course, be wealthy. His expenditure was often excessive, even reckless, which suggests poor accountability, which is more likely seen with narcissistic individuals or narcissists. But it's important to emphasize that this can possibly occur with an empath, where behavior has been affected by external stresses. However, the frequency and extent of his expenditure is less likely to be an external stressor because those external stresses won't keep happening again and again and again and again. And it points more likely to an embedded behavior, which moves us more to considering that he might be narcissistic or a narcissist. However, there is one important factor that militates against that, namely his ADHD diagnosis. This could mean that impulsivity plays a part in that. And therefore, in those circumstances, that could be the overriding factor with regard to his recklessness, with regard to the expenditure. Now, with the ADHD diagnosis, I must admit that having gone through the criteria and knowing what is known about Depp, it didn't strike me as the strongest diagnosis in the world. But at the end of the day, Dr. Kipper did find that diagnosis. That's the evidence that we have, and therefore we must have due regard to that. Grandiosity is clearly evident with his expenditure, which again is a narcissistic indicator, given the extravagance that has been exhibited. Depp also exhibits considerable generosity, which could be an example of financial largesse as a means of control. Many narcissists use their financial firepower by way of bribery, treats, taking people to expensive places, holidays, etc., as a means of not only managing a facade, but to assert control. It's also a manifestation of grandiosity. But there's also a suggestion that such generosity as exhibited by Depp could be demonstrative of his emotional empathy within this flamboyant grandiosity, a combination of both empathic and narcissistic traits. Depp was taken advantage of the tenants in the penthouses. He was also taken advantage, arguably, by the management group and possibly his former agent. This could be suggested, again, that essentially he didn't really care, and this was financial largesse and a lack of accountability. But I see this as more likely actual generosity on Depp's part, which suggests potentially the presence of emotional empathy. What about the views of other people? Depp is praised, admired, and loved by many. However, there are repeated and numerous criticisms of his behavior. I provided you with a wide range of views about his behavior from those who laud him and those who lambast him. I've also provided you with an extensive list of all of the good things that he's done and also the problematic behaviors that he has engaged in. If the level of problematic behaviors and criticisms was very low, this would be more in tune with the behavior of an empathic individual. A normal would not draw such polarizing responses from people. People would be a little more about them, not really having any major opinion. This mixed bag of reactions is seen more usually with narcissistic individuals or narcissists. Again, though, it is worth pointing out that the mixture could also be as a consequence of empathic behavior and then being eroded by external stresses, namely his addictions. We now move on to the issue of those addictions. With regard to drink and drugs, Depp has repeated issues with alcohol and drugs, and often these are a manifestation of narcissism, as they are a product of a sense of entitlement, a lack of emotional empathy, a lack of accountability, arrogance, dismissiveness, perceived invulnerability, and even fuel substitution, along with other factors. However, addiction issues can also be present in non narcissists and generate behaviors which create the impression of a narcissist, even though they're not. It's very clear Depp has addiction issues. He has been diagnosed by Dr. Kipper and Doc Brown, I apologize, Dr. Spiegel, as having substance abuse disorder. That has to be taken into account. In order to dispel the drink and drugs issue as being a manifestation of narcissism, emotional empathy ultimately needs to be found. If it is not, then narcissism is the more likely outcome. The repeated nature of Johnny Depp's use of drink and drugs to excess and his failure to tackle the addictions in any meaningful fashion, thus being accountable, less entitled, and operating with emotional empathy for those his behavior affects, does call into question whether he exhibits emotional empathy. An empathic individual with addiction issues will, of course, engage in problematic behaviors, but those external stressors have a lot of emotional empathy to erode before this happens on the scale and frequency seen with Johnny Depp. It's possible it could happen, but an empathic addict is less outlandish in the appearance of the behaviors, deals with the addiction in a less public way, owing to their weaker narcissistic traits. The repeated outlandish behaviors, for instance, being drunk at the awards ceremony, being found face down in the sand, inebriated and unconscious on a family holiday, and other instances which I've mentioned previously, alongside his repeated and systemic failure to address the issues, points either towards no emotional empathy or limited emotional empathy, which is far more quickly eroded and results in the exacerbation of existing strong narcissistic traits such as showmanship, anger, and argumentativeness. Manipulative behaviors. Depp is clearly manipulative. A consideration of his behaviors demonstrates flattery, the telling of lies, triangulation with object, triangulation with person, absent silent treatment, physical violence, smearing, invalidation, belittlement, withdrawal, denial, provocation, projection, blame shifting, use of threat, insult, destruction of property, shouting, argumentativeness, deflection, vagueness, and promised change. It is important to make clear that manipulative behavior can occur in empaths, normals, narcissistic people, and narcissists. It is, of course, seen far more often in narcissists. However, the addictions that Depp has would likely result in manipulative behavior appearing through the emotion of any emotional empathy that's present. The extent of these manipulations, if not those of a narcissist, leans more towards somebody with limited emotional empathy, as this is eroded faster, resulting in more types of manipulation and more frequent manipulative behavior. An external stressor, such as being abused, can result in the reactive abuse that occurs. So it's not a prima facie abusive behavior. He's not the instigator, but he still engages in abusive behaviors nevertheless. And the standard of emotional empathy will differ in terms of the amount that can be eroded. His children. Depp speaks well of his children, and has maintained relationships with them, notwithstanding his parting of the ways with their mother, Vanessa Paradis. This, prima facie, demonstrates accountability on the part of Depp, the acceptance of parental responsibilities. However, certain narcissists, of course, through facade management, are able to do this. Furthermore, his behavior does hint at absent or reduced emotional empathy, and his commentary about his parenting is less reliable. His son Jack has remained silent, neither praising nor condemning his father, and therefore we cannot read anything into his silence. His daughter has praised him, and effusively so. This is significant. The maintenance of a relationship, and more importantly, her comments about him, do not come from a blinded parasocial supporter, but someone who has spent a significant amount of time living with him, experiencing all that he has to offer. Contrast, for instance, the way that she has spoken about her father with the way that Jaden Smith talked about Jada Pinkett Smith, who we've already established is a narcissist. Lily Rose Depp. Support for her father, the nature and description of that support, and the absence of complaint about him suggests either he operates a very accomplished control of his daughter, but far more likely that there is evidence of some emotional empathy for his children. His relationships. This is where we find considerable weight in the determination of what Johnny Depp is. Depp has had many intimate partners. That invariably is an indicator of somebody who's a narcissist or narcissistic. Depp tends to fall in love quickly and idealize, again, the behavior of somebody who's a narcissist or narcissistic. Of course, emotional thinking from an empathic perspective can also cause the corruption of the love devotee trait to cause an individual to fall in love so quickly. Let's very promptly consider his relationships. Laurie Allison, first wife, no reported issues. Sherilyn Fenn, no reported issues. Jennifer Grey, there were allegations of problems, but I take her allegations with a large salt cellar. She has an axe to grind because of an alternative agenda in terms of self-publication. Winona Ryder, no major reported problems, and crucially defended Depp in the 2020 libel trial. Ellen Barkin, she was a side piece who was given evidence against Depp. I don't consider her evidence of particular weight. Mainly, I think she was quite simply fucked off at being a side piece and had something of an axe to grind. Kate Moss, problematic relationship, but she's a narcissist. Tali Chanel, no reported issues. Vanessa Paradis, no reported issues. 14-year relationship, defended him. There was suggestion of infidelity on Depp's part that contributed to the end of the relationship. That is a narcissistic trait. Finally, somebody called Amber Heard, who you might have heard of, who we've established is a narcissist. The two problematic relationships that Depp has had have both involved narcissists. The balance of the relationships do not show the usual pattern of somebody who is a narcissist. It could be the case, of course, that the others were far easier to control, but note there are numerous actresses amongst the list, and therefore they're likely to have fairly strong narcissistic traits, and therefore it may not have been as easy to control as one might think. It might just be that Depp is a highly accomplished narcissist, so the volatility in those relationships was hidden and controlled. But if he was such an accomplished narcissist, why was he not able to do that when it came to both Moss and Heard? The repeated nature of his relationships and the evidence provided by them supports the existence of emotional empathy, demonstrated by the longevity of them, the absence of complaints, the support and praise provided by not just one, but several individuals. Noting also that those that proffered support for him did so when Johnny Depp's stock was plummeting as a consequence of the allegations against him, and therefore it wasn't exactly the vogue thing to do. Where does this then leave us, since we've established the presence of emotional empathy in Johnny Depp? The normal. They do have emotional empathy, but I now discount normal as an outcome because A. Depp's narcissistic traits are far too strong for a normal individual. B. Normals would have departed the Moss and herd relationships, or perhaps even not been involved in them to begin with, because of the absence of the empathic addiction to narcissists or the lack of idealization and the need to assert control found with a narcissist. We therefore remove normal from the outcome. This leaves us with 3: narcissist, narcissistic, or empath. With regard to narcissist, since emotional empathy has been identified with regard to his family and his relationships, if not elsewhere, Depp cannot be a narcissist. Narcissists do not have emotional empathy, and therefore narcissist is removed from the running. This leaves us with either empath, somebody with substantial emotional empathy for a wide range of people, who can have strong narcissistic traits but even stronger empathic traits, and at the risk of emotional empathy being eroded by external stressors, resulting in narcissistic traits coming to the fore and poor behaviors, or a narcissistic individual, somebody with limited emotional empathy, very strong narcissistic traits, limited and weaker empathic traits. And again, those empathic traits and limited emotional empathy are also capable of being eroded by external stressors. Depp has shown frequent poor behavior. This is often as a consequence of him being on the receiving end of abusive behaviors towards him and the presence of his addictions. The frequency of these poor behaviors, however, suggests that he has limited emotional empathy to cope with these external stressors. Depp's behaviors have also been marked by a certain intensity and vitriol, at times when not necessarily affected by external stressors. Witness some of the comments that were made about Heard. Even though it was seen as a joke, the comments about burning her and also fucking a corpse, and also the observations about calling her a whore. He called Vanessa Paradis a cunt, the mother of his children. He's frequently argumentative, which is a narcissistic trait. He is seen as demanding, for instance, his behavior about the nudity issues concerning Heard and the loans that he sought. This is the narcissistic trait of selfishness. He has engaged in shouting, physical violence, which is the manifestation of the narcissistic trait of anger. He has repeatedly been described by many people as acting with jealousy. Jealousy is a narcissistic trait. All of the above supports limited emotional empathy. He also has a tendency to lash out and then think better of it afterwards, and then apologizing and reconsidering. For instance, the remarks that he made in the Rolling Stone interview about Harvey Weinstein. And given the presence that we know that he has emotional empathy, this cannot be false contrition. But the fact he moves to lash out so quickly shows limited emotional empathy and the behavior of a narcissistic individual whose emotional empathy isn't substantial enough to always protect in the first place and act in a safeguarding fashion. Instead, in effect, his emotional empathy that is there plays catch-up. The drink and drugs exacerbate traits which are already there, and given the nastiness demonstrated, this points to very strong narcissistic traits found with a narcissistic individual. It's also worth pointing out that were he an empath, he may have had more narcissist partners than he actually did. Accordingly, Johnny Depp is narcissistic. He has limited emotional empathy, but it is there, although it's limited. This shows that his philanthropy, for instance, is a mixture of emotional empathy, but combined with self-interest. He has very strong narcissistic traits. He has functioned with emotional empathy towards his family. He's functioned with emotional empathy with the generosity that he's shown to people, and people have taken advantage of that. He's shown emotional empathy towards his intimate partners, but it is quick to vanish and then unleashes problematic behaviors when those external stresses of being on the receiving end of abuse and the addictions are present. Accordingly, the determination of Johnny Depp is that he is narcissistic. Thank you very much for joining me in this conclusion. I know that there's a variance of views. Well done to those of you who identified it correctly. Commiserations to those of you who did not. Bear in mind, this is a complex individual, and there is no shame in getting it wrong. As you've seen from the many parts that I provided you with, it could go either way. And that was such an important lesson for everybody in terms of analyzing people and understanding more about narcissism and all the behaviors surrounding it, to see how individual behaviors can be taken in lots of different ways. What we do, of course, is then we look in the round. And the most important aspect here were the extent of his narcissistic traits, but also the finding of emotional empathy. And we found emotional empathy from the evidence that was provided by family, and also in terms of his intimate relationships. That was the most fundamental point. I'm very pleased that so many of you joined me in this live stream. And also, thank you very much for those of you that have shown super thanks for my extensive work in this regard. I do appreciate your generosity in that respect. I have not been able to individually thank you, as I was, of course, busy relaying the outcome to you all. But it's noted, and thank you for doing so. I'm now going to conclude this live stream in a matter of moments, so you can digest what you've heard, perhaps listen again, and provide your observations and comments on the outcome. You may not agree with me. Tough titty. I'm the ultra, therefore I must be right. But the point is, he's not a narcissist. He's not an empath. He's not a normal. He's narcissistic. He exhibits the presence of limited emotional empathy. He has very strong narcissistic traits. He does have empathic traits, but they are weaker. And many times he will show emotional empathy towards those that he deals with, but it can be very quickly eroded as a consequence of his addictions, and can also be very quickly eroded when he's on the receiving end of abuse. Hence, the often explosive responses that have been seen when he's been abused by Amber Heard. Where might all of this end up? Well, on balance, Heard's evidence lacks credibility, primarily because of her status as a narcissist, but even narcissists can tell the truth. It's more to do with a simple examination of the evidence and the way that she presents it shows that it isn't credible. But whether the jury will see through that remains to be seen. Excuse me. Depp may well be able to demonstrate that he's been defamed. I think that one potential difficulty that he has is the causal link between the defamation and the loss that has been suffered. But we shall see. There is, of course, a little more evidence to come in the trial, and we'll have the outcome. I will continue, of course, to provide you with incisive observations on key parts as they arise. There are further parts to do with Amber Heard, which includes, if she loses, will it be a mega pint of fury? Her protestation about, I'm not a victim. And of course, we need to talk a bit more about Dr. Spiegel and his cross-examination and the quite catastrophic appearance that he made. But will he care? I notice already some of you have latched onto his behaviors to make a determination as to what you suspect he might be. There will be further live streams upcoming also, where I will take your questions in the usual way and answer them. Thank you very much for joining me today. It's been a pleasure explaining all of this to you, and a point of pride for me also, as I've seen the dedication that many of you have applied in working this out and also applying what you have learned from the extensive work that I've provided to you. It is most rewarding for the Ultra to see that. I now wish you a good day, a good evening, or a good morning, and all it remains for me to say is, I'm H.G. Tudor. Thank you for listening.